Islam and greetings to you all. I rise giving all praise to Allah and the highest of honors to his prophet, Noble Drew Ali. I extend those honors to the harbinger and forerunner, Saint Garvey Bey, aka Marcus Mosiah Garvey. I extend honors to all true and divine prophets, and I extend honors to man, for when man honors man, he honors his father God Allah. In this video, Sheikh Way El, also known as Lord Abba, will attempt to trace the origin of the word Moor. This video also serves as a rebuttal to false scholars and teachers like Shaka Ndugu Kemet and his ilk and their falsified teachings on the Moors, and to address their anti-Cushitic remarks against the Moorish American Muslims with sound research and facts. I will separate doubt in this video about the origin of the name Moor, and more importantly, its usage from ancient times. Here is the composite etymological rendering of the word Moor as can be found by the online etymological dictionary. It reads: Moor, North African, Berber, late 14th century, from Old French Moor, from Middle Latin Moris, from Latin Morus, inhabitant of Mauritania, Northwest Africa, a region now corresponding to northern Algeria and Morocco. From Greek moros, perhaps a native name, or else cognate with moros, black. But this adjective only appears in late Greek and may as well be from the people's name as the reverse. Being a dark people in relation to Europeans, their name in the Middle Ages was a synonym for Negro, later 16th century, 17th century, used indiscriminately of Muslims, Persians, Arabs, etc., but especially those in India. First, many people falsely believe that Berbers are mixed tribes that simply have a hint of dark hue living in North Africa exclusively, and that the word originates with these mixed and light peoples as called by the Europeans. However, the original Berbers, like the original Moors, are unmixed. You can consult the works of that indefatigable scholar on the subject, Sister Dana Marnichi. I will end that doubt later on in this video as well. Again, I must bring you to the Negro laws of South Carolina of 1839. It reads: the term Negro is confined to slave Africans, the ancient Berbers, and their descendants. So it is clear that those who call themselves black today in the United States of America, black and Negro is the same word, just two different languages, are indeed the ancestors of the ancient Berbers or Moabites mentioned in that law today, who are undoubtedly Moors, who also has the distinct designation of Berber, which is the second definition of the etymological descriptive of Moor. This is empirical evidence of who Berbers are and who were captured in the slave trade and whom we all descend from. This is the reason why Prophet Drew Ali said that we here were the descendants of the ancient Moabites, whom inhabited the northwestern and southwestern shores of Africa, to which I undoubtedly showed and proved in my last video. And for this reason, mainstream academia will only show you mixed peoples who are Berbers, like when you go to Wikipedia and other sources. This is a secret kept hidden right in front of your faces. I will present in this video research on the possible origins of the name Berber and its connection to the word Moor. I say possible because our professionals in the field of etymology, philology, and linguistics have never concluded the source of the name Berber or Moor. Notice in the etymon, it's stated in the trace of the word Moor that it came from Greek moros, perhaps a native name, or else cognate with moros, black. Then it says, but this adjective only appears in late Greek, and may as well be from the people's name as the reverse. This means that Moor only became cognate, meaning related to the word black, in late Greek, which proves to us that this was not the original meaning or intent of the word, and the fact that they say it may be from the people's name in reverse ultimately proves that the etymologists never settled on Moor meaning black, because it does not mean that. And from their perspective, meaning those who have degrees in this field, found that it may as well be from the people's name, or the name of the people. We find cross-reference to this also in the works of William Smith, who wrote Mauritania in the Dictionary of Greek and Roman Geography, 1854, where the name Mori is translated to mean black only in the Alexandrian dialect, which is the Greek language spoken throughout post-classical antiquity from 300 BC to 300 AD. So to reiterate and stress, Moor does not mean black, and there are no etymologists or philologists or linguists who have ever concluded that Moor meant black. And if anyone like Shaka Ndugu Kemet or any of his contemporaries can prove the claim that they espouse, then please make a rebuttal video to this one, citing sources to back up your claims. Black alludes to slavery, and Noble Drew Ali informed us that if you are not careful, your own brother will put you back into slavery. Be careful of the people whom are insisting that you are blacks. We do find, however, the name Moor mentioned in some of our most ancient dialects for the name, being also mentioned as a people, a landmass, or even a mountain, and in some cases as the name of the first man in some of our most ancient cultures and civilizations. I will bring you to several sources that brings verity to this claim. We find in the works of Sister Drusilla Dungy Houston, that indefatigable scholar on the history of our ancient Kushite ancestors, in her book, The Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire, on page 127, where she states, in the Chaldean inscriptions, the vernacular name for Ethiopia was Merduk, and its maritime enterprise was very distinctly recognized. And the geographical lists on the Chaldean monuments, the name Maruk, Moro, was always joined with those of and Akkad. Vessels larger than the later Phoenician ships came from India. These seagoing merchants were not Aryan, but were of the Dravidian race. There are so many dynamics that I can touch on from the above cited, particularly the relationship noted between Maruk or Moro and Akkad. By using vernacular, she means that the word Maruk is read exactly in the tongue that it was written in. Maruk appears to be a pluralized version of Mir, or insofar as this researcher can tell. I do not present this as a definitive, as there is no finds by Assyriologists that conclude such. I come to this conclusion simply by looking at the word, and it is merely a theory. I am not here to romanticize and or embellish like these Afrocentric scholars and non-MST Moors have grown accustomed to, but present my claims in the most scholastic, methodological, and reasonable manner allowed. Notice too that she said their maritime enterprises was very distinctly recognized. From times of recorded history, the Moors have been known as a seafaring people who traveled the world by way of the seas. The parallels here, just in this instance, are outstanding. The Canaanite city of the Moabites was called Ar, A-R, whose ancestry came from ancient Akkad or Chaldea, according to the Bible. Ar is a corruption of U-R. I will touch on this point further a little later on in this presentation. We know that we verify information by cross-referencing several sources and comparing them. This is called methodology in the field of research when presenting scholastic finds, and of course other factors that I am still learning myself. In that, we bring you to the book, The Genesis of the Earth and of Man, or The History of Creation and the Antiquity of Races and Mankind by Edward William Lane, who is a British Orientalist, translator, and lexicographer. We read Muruk, Greek Mero, for Ethiopia, from whence Nergal came. It was further curious to observe that in all the geographical lists, Muruk and Makan were placed in juxtaposition with Ur and Akkad, an evident allusion to the line of the original immigration from Ethiopia along the southern shores of Arabia to the mouth of the Euphrates. Nergal was especially worshipped at Cutha, or Kutha. Early writers supposed Cutha or Kutha to be the same as Cush, as was relayed in my video, The Ancient Canaanites, Moabites, and Moors, Part 1. The Chaldean tongue was considered Hamitic, and so again we have this name Muruk, in this instance being the same as the Greek Meropes, identified by the Homeric name Ethiopia. The original name was indeed a variation of the name Mero, as we will undoubtedly see later on in this presentation. An interesting point here, if you all missed it, is that in both sources read above, Muruk is always in direct association with the ancient Ur of Babylon or Chaldea, and yet Muruk, according to these same sources, is the land of the Ethiops, with Muruk being the original name according to the Chaldeans, and Ethiops or Ethiopia being the Greek name given to our ancestors. This tells us that the dominion of the Moors stretched from Arabia up to ancient Canaan, all the way up into the ancient cities of Babylon or Chaldea. Use your reason and connect the pieces. They are right in front of your faces. I now bring you to the works of John Denison Baldwin, who was an early anthropologist. Baldwin's anthropological writing posited the origins of human civilization as arising from an Arabian or Northeast African people, i.e. the Cushites in prehistoric times. Remember, Prophet Noble Drew Ali said that the northeast and the southeast of Africa was the dominion of Cush, and northwest and southwest was the dominion of Ham. In his book, Prehistoric Nations, page 190, we cite, "The ruins of the Chaldean cities I have named is given in the first volume of George Rawlinson's 5 Great Monarchies of the Ancient Eastern World. Among the important facts discovered are the following. The ruins furnish what appears to be conclusive evidence that civilization was brought to Chaldea from Ethiopia, that is to say, from Arabia. In the inscriptions, the two countries are connected in such a way as makes any other conclusion impossible. Their vernacular name for Ethiopia is Muruk, and its maritime enterprise is very distinctly recognized." He goes on to say in page 192 that all the traditions of Babylonia and Assyria point to a connection in very early times between Ethiopia, southern Arabia, and the cities of the lower Euphrates. In the geographical lists, the name of Muruk, Ethiopia, and Makan are thus always conjoined with those of Hur and Akkad. The building of Hur, again, is the earliest historical event of which the Babylonians seem to have cognizance. But the inscriptions constantly refer to a tradition of the primeval leader by whom the Cushites were first settled on the Euphrates, and one of the names of this leader is connected with Ethiopia in a way that can hardly be accidental. I will now bring cross-references from other sources to back up these claims. In the book, Paradise Found, The Cradle of the Human Race at the North Pole, a study of the prehistoric world by William Fairfield Warren, who was part of a secretive group out of Wesleyan University, which was a contemporary, in a sense, to the Skull and Bones Secret Society. On page 236 from his works, we read thus: In Mount Meros, we have only the Greek form of Meru, as long ago shown by Cruiser. The one is the navel of the earth for the same reason that the other is. Egyptian Meru in some Egyptian texts, MCR, in Assyrian Meruk or Meruka, the seat of the famous oracle of Jupiter Ammon, was possibly named from the same world mountain. This would explain the passage in Quintus Curtius, which has so troubled commentators, wherein the object which represented the divine being is described as resembling a navel set in gems. Puranics say that the first climate is that of Meru. Among the Greeks and Romans, the first climate was that of Meroe, and he cites Wilford in Asiatic Researches, Volume 8, page 289. Remember, the Puranas were texts given to the Hindus about their great Kushite progenitors. Ganges, from whom their great river is named, was a Kushite, a Moor. He goes on to state, note that the great Hamite Kushite race from the east was the first to settle Egypt and Babylon. That this Bible race can be traced to Mount Meru on the high tablelands of Central Asia. That the races immigrating from that region can be traced from thence to the four quarters of the earth, and that however widely separated, they can be retraced to their common home, the Eden of Genesis. See, the biblical Eden is not at all some fanciful tale. All ancient accounts, even before the compilation of the Torah, cites one mystical place from whence the first man came. The name of this first man, meaning male and female, according to my research, will be shown forthcoming. Then I found this interesting account in the same book on page 167, and it states, Strabo's account of it is full of the legendary features, characteristics of an earthly paradise. The olive trees were of extraordinary excellence, and there were 7 varieties of refreshing wine. He informs us that the great clusters were a cubit in length, and the vine trunks sometimes so thick that 2 men could scarcely clasp round one of them. Herodotus describes the mountain as very tapering and round, so lofty moreover that the top, they say, cannot be seen. The clouds are never quitting it either summer or winter. The natives call this mountain the Pillar of Heaven, and they themselves take their name from it, being called Atlantes. They are reported not to eat any living thing and never to have any dreams. Ironically, we find this description of the large grapes in 2 other places. One is in the Bible, and the other is in the oral sayings of our prophet Noble Drew Ali. The biblical account is reported from Joshua, the spy, whom Moses sent to spy on the ancient land of Canaan before they conquered it. We read at Numbers 13:23 of the King James Version of the Bible that, and they came unto the brook of Eshcol, and cut down from thence a branch with 1 cluster of grapes, and they bare it between 2 upon a staff, and they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. Prophet Noble Drew Ali said, and I quote, before the Europeans came here, the bananas were large and the grapes were 4 in hand. It took 2 men with hand sticks to carry 1 bunch of grapes. That is an interesting correlation between these 3 sources that requires much more detailed research. Notice in the above cited verse from Strabo, he said that the natives took on the name Atlantes. I will now link you to some very interesting history on the Moors in this regard. According to the Sister Dana Marnici, who wrote the ethno-history of the Moors in the book The Golden Age of the Moors by Ivan van Sertima, she states some of the Libyan tribes that are mentioned by Herodotus are the Nasamones, Gindanes, Macles, Gamphinsantes, Gilligame, Scilly, Atlanteans, Lotophagi, Massai, Adramacade, and Aussie. According to William Smith's Mauritania in the Dictionary of Greek and Roman Geography, 1854, a historical retrospect dictionary of Greek and Roman geography, we read, "These Moors, who must not be considered as a different race from the Numidians, but as a tribe belonging to the same stock, were presented by Sallust as a remnant of the army of Hercules, and by Procopius as the posterity of the Canaanians who fled from the robber Joshua." He quotes two columns with a Phoenician inscription. So here we have Atlanteans being identified with early Moors and as the remnants of the army of Hercules. This find, based on what we have cited above, reveals a stunning correlation between the place known as Eden and Paradise, which has for its names Meru, Meroe, and Meropes, not to forget Maruk, and early notable scholars that noted the relationship with the accounts coming from the records of Hindu Kush and that of Meroe by the same exact name bearing the same exact meaning. For this, we take you to the book Har Moab, or the Mountain of the Assembly, a series of archaeological studies chiefly from the standpoint of the cuneiform inscriptions by Orlando Dana Miller and Stephen Munson Whipple. On page 405, we read, "Meropes, king of the island of Kos, husband of the nymph Euphemia and father of Eumelus. His wife was killed by Diana because she had neglected to worship that goddess. Merops, in order to rejoin his wife, wished to make away with himself, but Juno changed him into an eagle, whom she placed amongst the stars. 2. King of the Ethiopians, by whose wife Clymene, Helios became the father of Phaethon." So here we have Meropes being mentioned as the king of the Ethiopians. Remember, John Dennison Baldwin did not give the name of the king in the source cited earlier. Thus, Merops is to be identified with the constellation of the eagle, or Aquila. But to the above extract should be added the following: Meropes, an ancient name of the inhabitants of the island of Kos from an early king, Merops. It remains now to show that the name Merops is only another form of the word Meru, applied to the first men issuing from the sacred mount, that is to say, the Meropes. In reference to the locality of this original human abode, M. Lenormand observes, "The culminating points are the Bellertag and the vast plateau of Pamir, so well calculated to sustain a primitive population, yet in a pastoral state, and of which the name under its first form was Upameru, the country under the Meru, or perhaps Upamira, the country near the lake, which itself had been the motive of the appellation of Meru. There are again certain traditions of the Greeks that force themselves upon our notice, particularly that involved in the sacred phraseology Meropes Anthropoi, which can only mean the men issued from Meru. Among the Hindus, the men before the deluge, as well as those after the deluge, descend from Meru. It is there that we find the Uttarakuru, veritable terrestrial paradise, the traditions relative to which were collected by Megasthenes. It is there also that we are conducted by the paradisical myth of the Meropes among the Greeks, that is, the men of Meru, a myth which had been transported to Greece and localized in the island of Kos. On page 406 we read, "Confirmation of the interpretation thus supported that the same name Merops is connected with that of Ethiopia, a country particularly mentioned by Moses in his geographical description of Eden, this being of course the Asiatic and not the African Ethiopia. Finally, the name Kos, given to the island ruled by Merops, can be no other than Cush, by which the Cushite race was so generally known. Merops is, then, only another name of the first man, applied to the primeval abode of humanity under the form Meru, like Asgard from Askur among the Scandinavians, and Askar, propitious summit among the inhabitants of the Euphrates Valley. So it is evident, based on the conclusion of those who studied in depth the Greek and Hindu mythology, and the fact that you find Kush also mentioned on the walls of Egypt, that early archaeologists and scholars noted that the cause of unknown derivation and mythical acclaim is a transliteration of Kush, and so the connection between whom the Greeks called Ethiopians and its most ancient name of Kush is very clear and undeniable. We find this in another early source called the American Antiquarian and Oriental Journal, volume 34, edited by Stephen Denison Peake and J.O. Kinnaman. It says, Kush or Kush is written Kus or Kus, as sh is really equal to s plus the consonant y sound. The Greeks tried to produce the sh before vowel endings by inserting I equal to Y after S, as in Cassiotes, that is Kashot or Kushit, and Massius, that is Mash, mountains north of Mesopotamia. So here we find this place called Meru being spoken of by the Greeks, a mythical paradise because it was never located by the aforementioned, coupled with another non-located island called Kas, to which the scholars have asserted you get the name Kush from. Notice that Lenormand mentions that the Meru are the people before the deluge and after the deluge. In the European's Bible, when speaking about the sons of God at Genesis 6:4 of the King James Version, it says, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Many have falsely attributed the term Nephilim, the word for giants in this verse, to mean some beings that came from another planet. However, these giants were merely giants in reputation, and that is why they are called men of old, men of renown, meaning men of high praise and status from a time of remote antiquity before our chronological systems are recorded, and the legend of them, which can be found inscribed upon the walls of Chaldea by name and copied into the Greek mythos and thus preserved. We bring you back again to the indefatigable scholar on Cushitic history, Drusilla Dungy Houston, and what she has to say about these men of Meru on page 31 of the second volume of her book, Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire, which echoes her revelation to this fact in book 1, when she says, historians have been much confused because they could not see in Meroe in Africa the beginnings of culture, but Meroe was but the late development of a very old civilization. There had been an older Meru in Asia. Hindu records call the first men of the world men of Meru. Where was this earlier site? We must look for it in the east. On page 66, she states that the race of the Upper Nile was primitively Asiatic can be shown by the Hindu Puranas. They speak of the Kushites as going to India before they went to Egypt, thus proving Hindu civilization coeval with that of Chaldea. Britannica, in edition 14, places Indian culture as early as 3300 BC and was higher than that of contemporary Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Puranas say that the Egyptians were a colony drawn out of Kushi Dweepa, and that the Pali, another colony, the later Phoenicians followed them from the land of Kush. In still more primitive days, the central seat had been at Meru, or Mount Meru in Asia. Lenormand speaks of the first men of the ancient world as men of Meru. Sanskrit writings speak of Indra, chief god of the Hindu, as king of Meru. Thus, primitive India was settled from tribes from Caucasus, which had settled upon the Nile River. Kushites in India and Ethiopia were little different in feature, color, and civilization. She continues, in the traditions of Kushites, one of the most celebrated of the ancient kings was Deva Nahusha, a sovereign of Meru, who extended his empire over 3 worlds. Archaeological findings prove that there was such an empire. The lost literature of Asia Minor dealt with this extension of the Ethiopian domain. An old poem, Phrygia, was the history of Dionysus, one of the celebrated Ethiopians. It was written in a very old language. He preceded Menes by many ages. Authentic books which would give us the true story concerning him perished long before the historic Greeks, who converted him into their drunken god of wine. They misconstrued and distorted the old Kushite mythology wherever they failed to understand it. Kushites furnished the Greeks and the Hindu with the material for their mythologies. The last extension of the Kushite Empire was to the Americas. Among Indians, we find language with words that are Mandingan or West African. Early Indians were called Meropes. Now, this brings us to an interesting tribe inhabiting Africa in Kenya. They are simply called the Meru. In a book entitled Customs and Traditions of Meru by Daniel Nyaga, there is a great evidence that links this tribe with the aforementioned sources and what Prophet Drew Ali revealed to us about our people coming from the ancient land of Canaan and inhabiting Africa. Notice the sitting position of this tribesman, which was obviously painted as a depiction of one of the tribesmen. When you flip Prophet Noble Drew Ali's picture, where he's demonstrating several signs beyond even the scope of Freemasonry, we see a striking likeness. It was just something that caught my attention, and I thought that I would add it from a visual perspective. There are no accidents and there are no coincidences, as law governs all events. On page 6 of this book, it reads, the direction the Meru came from. The Meru say that before they settled in their present land, they had come from the far north. According to a spokesman of Njuri Nchiki, ex-chief M. Mura M. Kariani, which believed that they migrated from Misri. This connotes that the Meru could be the descendants of black Jews called Falasha, who lived in the northern environs of Lake Tana in the land known then as Meroe, which lay between the river Atbara and what is known today as Blue Nile in the south of Egypt. The ancient Meroe, as well as other ancient zones like Nubia and Kush, which were adjacent to Meroe, are today regions of Sudan. When you go to the footnotes on 1, it says, in 1968, I also learned that with surprise from this old man that to date there are still artifacts in Meru which the Meru brought from Misri. B, it states, Alfred M. Mnyara in his book The Restatement of Bantu Origin in Meru History, page 162, indicates that a number of Kenyan Bantu-speaking groups had their ancestors migrating from Misri, meaning Egypt. On page 138 of said book, we read, as such, it gives the option to imagine that the Meru, who claim to have come from Misri, as it is indicated on page 6, and who, up to date, claim to have some articles hidden in their Meru land, which their ancestors brought with them from Misri, could be descendants of such Jews as the Falasha Jews. This explains why, as it is noted on page 57, the Meru, in their own way, had adopted crucifixion, which was used by some people like Romans even before the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. It also explains the reason for retaining such practices like stoning, as was practiced by the Jews, and for observing the unique practice of abstaining from sexual relations for 3 days after marriage, as it is noted here below. However, besides acknowledging the possibility of having come from the north, as the Meru oral tradition has it, the linguistic traits, culture, and so forth suggest that the people of the Nile and their neighbors, through migration, might have settled in Meru land. This matches with the opinion of those who link the Meru with the Jews, either in the diaspora or direct from Palestine. So what a parallel. You have people who have done research into this tribe named the Meru, who say that they descend from Misri, which is Egypt, akin to the Hebrew term Misraim, obviously, and that based on artifacts collected in general observation, the tribe appears to have descended from the Falashas, who are the Limba tribe that came from Canaan thousands of years ago after being forced out. They also claim to descend from an island called Mbwa, and they share the slopes of Mount Meru with their neighbors in Tanzania, whom are ironically called the Meru. And those reporting have intimated that these same exact people could have come from Meroe of Cushite fame. You simply cannot dismiss this as some form of happenstance and must recognize the connection, and that Prophet Noble Drew Ali was all wise, right, and exact. Also, the Meru tribe claimed to be captured and enslaved by the Red Man, and that is why they had to flee, as you will see on page 4 of said book. That brought me to an interesting passage that I read in Drusilla Dungy Houston's book, where she stated on page 32 that the pictures on the Egyptian monuments reveal that Ethiopians were the builders. They, not the Egyptians, were the master craftsmen of the earlier ages. The first courses of the pyramids were built of Ethiopian stone. The Cushites were a sacerdotal or priestly race. There was a religious and astronomical significance in the position and shape of the pyramids. Dubois points to the fact that in Upper Egypt, there were pictured black priests who were conferring upon red Egyptians the instruments and symbol of priesthood. So, according to this source and the source that she is citing, using the color-coded system that our people have come to accept in these days and times, there was a so-called black race, meaning our people, passing the scepters of rule and priesthood onto a so-called red race. This parallel simply cannot be ignored, and the people of Meru land say that they were captured and enslaved by the red race. This is a subject in and of itself that will be taken up at another time, for the breadth of such a discussion will double the time that this video is allotted. There is also an Australian tribe by the name Meru, who range from full-blooded Moor to Hawaiian-looking. Their name is also said to be Martu. The ancient Amorite name is Amuru, and their god was called Martu. Coincidence? I think not. The Romans called the Moors in their vernacular tongue the Morusi. In my last video on the ancient Canaanites and Moabites, I showed and proved to you from the accounts of contemporaneous sources that 2 columns in Tangier were there, and it spoke of how the ancient Canaanites or Berbers who traveled from the ancient land of Canaan to North Africa were ran out by Joshua, the robber son of Nun. I have found a source that cites that name translated on those inscriptions to actually read Morusi in the Roman tongue. This is a shout out to the brother Ali Muhammad of the ISIS organization, who claimed that what Prophet Noble Drew Ali brought us was a bunch of mumbo jumbo, and that the ancient Canaanites were pale Arabians and things of that nature. He offered to pay me $1,000 if I can link the word Moor with the ancient Canaanites in any way. I will now bring you to the source called Machiavelli, the chief works and others by Niccolo Machiavelli, and Alan H. Gilbert, page 346, where it reads, and I quote, "Because I have said above that sometimes such people are driven from their own abodes by war, by which they are obliged to seek new lands, I wish to bring up the instance of the Morusi, a people anciently in Syria," meaning ancient Canaan. "Observing the Hebrew people come and judging they could not resist them, the Morusi thought they would be wisest to save themselves by leaving their own country, rather than, in an attempt to save it, lose themselves with it. Hence, departing with their families, they went into Africa to make their abode, driving away the inhabitants they found there. Thus, men unable to defend their own country were able to conquer that of others. Procopius writes of the war of Belisarius, fought against the Vandals, conquerors of Africa, reports that he read letters written on certain columns in places where these Morusi lived, which said, 'We are the Morusi, who fled before the face of Joshua, the robber, the son of Nun,' and this appears the cause of their departure from Syria." So in this instance, he, Machiavelli, appears to cite Procopius in full by stating that we are the Morusi, or the Moors, who fled before the face of Joshua the robber son of Nun. That portion, we are the Morusi, has never been cited in that manner by any of the sources who have reported on this legend. If this be the case, then this column, which none of my other sources identify by name other than the fact that they were ancient Canaanites that peopled North Africa, proves that these people that fled from ancient Canaan did indeed call themselves by the name Moor in their ancient tongue. These ones who were forced to flee, as I have shown and proved in my video on the ancient Canaanites part 2, were indeed Moabites, and they tell these accounts themselves until this very day. Now, I want to bring you to another mystical mountain which is mentioned in the Bible called Mount Moriah. Again, so many linguistic and cultural connections that only one seeking to remain ignorant will ignore. Some biblical scholars have wholly concluded that Moriah is simply the land of the Amorites, and our Moorish history tells us that the Amorites came over to and helped build the kingdoms of North Africa. We are waking up now, Moors, and our history is being revealed to us this day. Praise Allah. So let us bring you to the specialist on Asiatic history, that eminent indefatigable scholar Godfrey Higgins, in his book Anacalypsis, to find what he has to say upon the biblical Mount Moriah and ancient Meru. On page 52, he states, "The 7 earths, one above another, is a circumference so totally inapplicable to Jerusalem and so clearly Hindu that the identity of the two cannot be mistaken." Wilford says, "Meru, with its 3 peaks on the summit and its 7 steps, includes and encompasses really the whole world, according to the notion of the Hindus and other nations, previously to their being acquainted with the globular shape of the earth. I mentioned in the first part that the Jews were acquainted with the 7 stages, zones, or dweepas of the Hindus, but I have since discovered a curious passage from the Zohar Manesi on the creation, as cited by Besnaj in his history of the Jews. There are, says the author, 7 earths, whereof one is higher than the other, for Judea is situated upon the highest earth, and Jerusalem upon the highest mountain of Judea. This is the hill of God, so often mentioned in the Old Testament, the mount of the congregation where the mighty king sits in the sides of the north, according to Isaiah, and there is a city of our God. The Meru of the Hindus has the name of Sabha, or the congregation, and the gods are seated upon it in the sides of the north. There is the holy city of Brahmapuri, where resides Brahma with his courts, and his most pure and holy land, Ilavata. The Judea, or Laudia, in Jerusalem named above are evidently compared to the North Pole and Mount Meru, which is thus called the place of Laudi. We should presently find that with the Arabians, the pole star was called the Star of Laudi. The following passages from the Bible are very striking. Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. The mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem and Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father. For thou hadst said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem shall be called the city of truth, and the mountain of the Lord of hosts, the holy mountain. When we consider that our Bible is merely the sacred writings of the temple upon the mountain, or Sion, or Moriah, or Meru, the exaggeration above is only that we might expect to find in them. Thus, the Indians say the same of their Meru. Some biblical scholars have concluded that the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock is located, is indeed this Mount Moriah. Some link it to another biblical special place called Moreh, M-O-R-E-H, and in each account it is associated with a hill or a mountain, which brings me excitedly to the next point that really slams it home for me. The Egyptian spelling for pyramid is M-R. Can you say ironic? M-R is pronounced Meri. You can find this at Gardner's Egyptian sign list at U6. Ta means land in the Egyptian, and one of the most ancient names for Egypt was, yep, you guessed it, Ta Meri, which means land of the Meri. Here are the glyphs. The first glyph is Meri when speaking about a pyramid, as you can clearly see the pyramidal shape within the glyph. The second Meri shown means to love. There should be no doubt that we find an ancient land called Meru by the Hindus, Merops by the Greeks. We find the people of Meru in Kenya, who claim to have come from the north, and by those who researched concluded that they were a Falasha tribe and named their land Meruland, whom are also speculated to have been at Meroe, a later kingdom in Egypt under Kushite rule, all living by a hill or mountain or a man-made mountain, i.e. pyramid, who claim to descend from an island. If you think this to be pure happenstance or coincidence, then you do not care about the facts. These parallels simply cannot be ignored. Now, I want to return back to Sister Dungy Houston's book, Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire, Book 1. In her chapter on the ancient Indian civilization, she states the following. Even the name Hindu is Ethiopian. Ancient records of authority made Hind and Sind sons of Cush. Philostratus and Vit Apollon Lib 2 says, the Indi are the wisest of mankind. The Ethiopians are a colony of them, and they inherit the wisdom of their fathers. The separation of India from the parent Kushite stock was in ages long before the rise of the so-called Aryans in India. The older Greeks always associated the sacred waves of the Indian Sea with the wonderful Ethiopians. Ephorus stated that they occupied all the southern coasts of Asia and Africa. As in Chaldea, they brought to the aboriginal tribes of India the knowledge of metals to take the place of stone implements. They brought the knowledge of the arts. Their funeral remains all over India reveal the stone circles and upright massive menhirs of North Africa. They understood in those far distant ages how to make hard earthenware, iron weapons, and ornaments of gold. Today, in a state of degenerated art, Sind is the only province where the potter's craft is artistic. before Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador to the court of the non-Aryan Chandragupta about 300 BC, the Greeks mentioned as Indi only the Kushites of the areas between the Hindu Kush and Persia. She dedicates a whole chapter to this particular subject, and again, I urge all Moors to get that book. You can find it free online. It is rich with Kushitic history and the tracing of our people from a methodological standpoint. So to sew together this fabric of the early Hindu Kushite connection and tying in the men of Meru, I want to bring you to Anacalypsis and what Godfrey Higgins had to say about the Buddha heads that he had examined. He states, "The religion of Buddha of India is well known to have been very ancient. In the most ancient temples scattered throughout Asia, where his worship is yet continued, he is found black as jet, with the flat face, thick lips, and curly hair of the Negro. Several statues of him may be met with in the Museum of the East India Company. There are 2 exemplars of him brooding on the face of the deep upon a coiled serpent. To what time are we to allot this Negro? He will be proved to have been prior to the god called Krishna. He must have been prior to or contemporaneous with that black empire supposed by Sir William Jones to have flourished at Sidon. The religion of this Negro god is found by the ruins of his temples and other circumstances to have been spread over an immense extent of country, even to the remotest parts of Britain, and to have been professed by devotees inconceivably numerous. And this particular group was founded to bring a true accounting of Asia, that which is east of here, not just the continent we know today of as Asia. Notice that he said that several statues of this Buddha with its quote-unquote black features may be found in the East India Company. That company has been defunct and became the United States of America. Imagine what secrets they have concealed. In this, Godfrey Higgins admits that the religion of Buddha is a Moorish one, but using the misnomer black. To drive home my point, in my first video citing from this same chapter in Anacalypsis, where Godfrey Higgins said that there existed a nation of blacks that ruled all of Asia from Sidon, and that this empire is so old, so remote, that it is beyond their regular chronologies. Here he says that this Buddha existed either before this very, very ancient empire or contemporaneous with, meaning at the same time with that empire, speaking to the antiquity of Buddha, which is none other than Baal and Nimrod and Hercules and Jesus and the other heroes of old said to be the sons of God. So here we have in this instance the connectivity of ancient Kush with India, to which Godfrey Higgins as well as Dungy Houston essentially highlights in their respective works, and the fact that the Hindus themselves, as is noted in their Puranas, considered their division as part of Kushadweepa, is proof in and of itself of this connection. It is in these Puranas that the oldest men, as we have shown earlier, were known as the men of Meru, that is Merduk, Merdops, and Merdo. Dungy Houston further validates this on page 225 of Book 1, where she is citing Sir Henry Rawlinson, who was a renowned Middle Eastern scholar and generally recognized as the father of Assyriology. She states, Rawlinson says of the early founders of Indian civilization, recent linguistic discoveries show that a Kushite race did in the earliest times extend itself along the southern shores of the continents from Abyssinia to India. The whole peninsula of India, the seacoast of Baluchistan and Kerman, by the inscriptions belong to this race. Wilford, who had an extended and thorough knowledge of Hindu mythology, points out the Sanskrit writings describe the extended domains of the ancient Kushite Empire. And these books are relations about early Egyptian history. It mentioned one of the migrations going out from the Upper Nile as having peopled India. The Puranas divided the world into 7 dweepas or divisions. Sancha Dweepa was Africa in general. Kusha Dweepa was the land of Kush, India, and the Mediterranean. To further validate this connection, we look at the Buddhists of ancient Egypt. Archaeological evidence supports the fact that there were Buddhist elements in Egypt and Meroe. The Buddhists used the Kharosthi script, which is almost identical to the Mariatic script. Let me cite Higgins again from page 54 of that same exact chapter, where he states, Herodotus says that there were 2 Ethiopian nations, one in India, the other in Egypt. He derived his information from the Egyptian priests, a race of people who must have known the truth, and there seems no reason either for them or Herodotus to have misstated the fact. Philostratus says that the gymnosophists of Ethiopia, who settled near the sources of the Nile, descended from the Brahmins of India, having been driven thence for the murder of their king. This, Philostratus says, he learnt from an ancient Brahmin called Jarkis. Another ancient writer, Eustathius, also states that the Ethiopians came from India. These concurring accounts can scarcely be doubted, and here may be discovered the mode and time also when great numbers of ancient rites and ceremonies might be imported from India into Egypt, for that there was a most intimate relation between them in very ancient times cannot be doubted. It is indeed not doubted. The only question has been whether Egypt borrowed from India or India from Egypt. All probability is clearly, for 1,000 reasons, in favor of the superior antiquity of India, as Bailey and many other learned men have shewn, a probability which seems to be reduced to a certainty by Herodotus, the Egyptians themselves, and the other authors just now quoted. There is not a particle of proof from any historical records known to the author that any colony ever passed from Egypt to India, but there is, we see, direct positive historical evidence of the Indians having come to Africa. You see, the gymnosophists were Buddhists, and they wrote in the Kharosthi script, which has every element of the Mariatic script. What Godfrey Higgins fails to cite in the above is that Philostratus also says in his book, The Life of Apollonius, that the gymnosophists also lived in Meroe, lived there. This led to the theory that the gymnosophists, who were Buddhists, did indeed introduce the Mariatic script to that Cushitic empire. Judging from these accounts and the language placement of the word Ethiopia, contingent upon the evidence of the sources shown above, we can safely replace the word Ethiopia with Maruk, Meroe, and Meroes, where we would undoubtedly get the word more from. The preponderance of evidence defeats the doubts. The connectivity of historical events and names upholds logic. When you look at the artistic renderings in the Ajanta caves of India, which ironically appear to have been carved out of the side of a mountain, you will find many images of Kushites or Moors in their paintings. In some paintings, you find that the Moors outnumber even the lighter shaded Hindu, and in some instances they are shown only Moors with green skin. They are revered in these images, and statues are made in their image and after their likeness. Now, let us continue. It appears as if there were 2 migrations into Egypt from the Hindu Kushites. One was during the Persian period of 539 BC and later under the edicts of Asoka Maurya around 274 BC. And he had commissioned missionaries into Egypt. Asoka sent these missionaries to preach the Buddhist Dharma in Egypt sometime after he had converted to Buddhism somewhere around 260 BC. Ironically enough, Asoka was ruler of one of the greatest Indian empires called the Maurya. This kingdom was known for having the lion as its national emblem. A quadratic-headed lion figure was also always shown in the art of ancient Moria. This lion's face can only be seen 3 at a time. Incongruously, we find this same exact iconography in early Meroe. Here we see the triple-headed lion Epidemic being shown with Queen Amenetori, who ruled from 1 AD to 20 AD. Notice that the lion deity has 4 arms, which, shown in this manner, is very comparable to the Hindu Shiva. Herodotus in Book 2 of his Histories says, Strabo mentions the worship of Hercules, Pan, and Isis, as well as a barbaric god at Meroe. And in the temples of that country, whether erected by Ethiopians or by Egyptian monarchs who ruled there, many other gods shared in the worship paid to the principal deity of the sanctuary. Besides, many of the usual Egyptian deities are some of uncommon form peculiar to Ethiopia, and that Wadi Owetaibi is one with 3 lions' heads and 4 arms, more like an Indian than an Egyptian god, though he wears a headdress common to gods and kings, especially in Ptolemaic and Roman times. He was perhaps the barbaric god mentioned by Strabo. The whole character of the temple is copied from Egypt, and the Amun of Thebes and the ram-headed Noom or Noob hold the most conspicuous places there. Here is a relief of the lion god Epidemic at Naga. Naga is the name of the cosmic mystical serpent of Hindu mythos. Notice this lion god is shown as a coiled serpent with a lion's head springing from a Hindu-style lotus. This is why the early archaeologists describe this god as being peculiar to Egypt, and that is because of the relationship of the Cushitic symbols of Meroe with those of the ancient system of Kushadweepa, that is India. The symbol here proves their affinity. The archaeologists prove their relationship. Also, the Greeks would call the Moors of North Africa barbarians, and the Egyptians would call those that came from the east as well barbarians, according to the decipherment of these archaeologists and scholars. This is the funerary stela of Metei of Meroe. This stela dates back to the 2nd to 3rd centuries AD. It comes from grave 275 at Karang or Karanag. The stela is located in Cairo Egyptian Museum at JE 40229. The couple shown here, Metei and Abakata, stand under the inner wings of the sun disk. Metei wears her hair with a top knot and cornrows. The only other known women that this researcher has come across so far that is of Moorish descent, do remember I do not use the term black, that wore their hair in a top knot were the Moorish Amazonian troop of 300 women that fought with the Almoravid or Moabite dynasty, particularly in the taking of Spain. These Berber women were said to be some of the greatest and fiercest warriors North Africa had ever seen. Notice also the swastika. That is usually associated with Hindu theology, and yet we find this etched upon a stela that is found in Meroe. The parallels pummel you. You cannot ignore nor deny the relationship, and these people were called the men of Meru by the Hindu records, and yet the name of this empire, where we are now pointing out these parallels, is called Meroe, to which all early scholars have agreed is identified as Meru and Meropes of mythical fame. I want to also point out, in all fairness, the Meroitic word for Meroe is Medawi. To attempt further to prove the relationship of these Meroites with the Moors, who called themselves by the name Berberi or Berber, I bring you to an interesting artifact of the Meroitic period. This is the stela of a Kandake, or queen, Amina Sheketo, from the temple of Amen hypostyle hall, who ruled 10 BC to 1 AD. To the left is the goddess Amasemi. To the right is Queen Amina Sheketo. Notice the ritualistic scarification upon her face. Here is a picture of an Oromo woman of the Sudan, the seat of ancient Meroe, which can be found in Flanders Petrie's A History of Egypt Part 1, page 126. I want to draw your attention to the ritual scarification of what looks to be 3 lines upon the right side of her face. The Oromo are indeed a Berber tribe who descend from the ancient Moabite and Canaanite tribes that settled in Africa many thousands of years ago. For more information on those ancient tribes, please consult my video, The Ancient Canaanites Part 2, The Moabites, for more detail. Any mastermind knows that there are no strange happenings, no coincidences, that law governs all events. So how ironic that we find Maruk as Meroe and or Meru, which has been noted by early archaeologists and scholars that this same Maruk, which is Ethiopia in their lexicon, is always juxtaposed with of ancient Chaldea, the birthplace of the Moabites, who traveled to ancient Canaan and established a city called Ar, which could very well have been called who indeed are the same exact people who are the Berbers of North Africa and are the same exact Berbers or Barabra of the Nile region of Sudan. A picture has been painted for you and the colors are quite vivid. Now, in the later part of this demonstration, we set out to prove the existence, the Kushites and the Hindus and their connections that is displayed throughout the historical references of early scholars and the walls themselves. Remember, the walls don't lie, people do. How ironic is it that the Hindus, who admit to receiving their knowledge and rituals of worship from the ancient Kushites, have said that these ancient men were called the men of Meru, and then the Kushites, forming themselves a kingdom after being pushed out by the Ptolemaic dynasties, formed themselves a kingdom called Meru or Meroe on an island, mind you, and built many pyramids in that place. The pyramid is indicative to the world mountain that was anciently called Meru. I have brought forth the most compelling evidence ever compiled on the origins of the name Moor. These are the men of Meru, of which the Hindus said ruled all of the world. So when Prophet Noble Drew Ali informs us that the Moors once ruled the world and that the Moors were living up and down the Mississippi, we know exactly where he is going with it. The ancient historians, as I have shown, have stated that these Moors are indeed from the sunken island of Atlantis, or islands. I theorize that after the destruction of Atlantis, the Moors made landfall somewhere near Spain and in North Africa. I also theorize that from Spain, these Moors inhabited ancient Turkey and Babylon and connected with other civilizations and eventually settled in Africa, just as Prophet Drew Ali and many other early specialists on Asiatic culture has noted. I also theorize that maybe these God-men or these sons of God did see Homo sapiens sapiens or even Neanderthal types and saw that they were fair and bred with them, which could be what Genesis 6:4 is relating, as scientists have concluded that all non-African peoples on the planet still possess at least 2% Neanderthal DNA. Again, let me state that is my theory. The Moors, when they went to Spain and took it over in the 700 AD, had implemented everything that was done in Atlantis. It is said that there were public bathhouses in Atlantis, and you find the same things in Spain. There was said to be those who could extract the sweet fragrances of flowers and make perfumes out of them in Atlantis, and the Moors did the same thing in Spain. There was technology spoken of in Atlantis that you found nowhere else on the earth, and yet when you get to Spain, you see the same exact technology. The Moors had streetlights in Seville, Spain, 600 years before the Europeans had them in Europe. It was said that you could walk into one of the lavish Moorish homes in Moorish Spain and see mechanical lions made out of gold that actually roared. You don't find instances like that until you get into the mechanical birds and mechanical owls that the Greeks borrowed from the accounts of the ancient Moors, whom they dubbed Aethiops. In Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages, in his chapter titled Atlantis and the Gods of Antiquity, on page 81 we read, in the introduction to his translation of the Timaeus, Thomas Taylor quotes from A History of Ethiopia written by Marcellus, which contains the following reference to Atlantis. For they, the Ethiopians, relate that in their time there were 7 islands in the Atlantic Sea, sacred to Proserpine, and besides these 3 others of an immense magnitude, one of which was sacred to Pluto, another to Ammon, and another, which is the middle of these, and is of 1,000 stadia, to Neptune. Crantor, commenting upon Plato, asserted that the Egyptian priests declared the story of Atlantis to be written upon pillars, which was still preserved circa 300 BC. See Beginnings or Glimpses of Vanished Civilizations, Ignatius Donnelly. It almost begs the question and makes us wonder if these were the pillars that was cited by Procopius and 100 years before him, Moses of Corinth. You see, in him citing that old manuscript by Marcellus, about whom the Ethiopians, as they call them, have stated who these great 3 islands belong, we must understand the relationship and try to connect it. Pluto is Osiris, Ammon is Cush, and you can find this also said in Dungy Houston's work, and Neptune is Poseidon. Diodorus the Sicilian stated in an interview with the Ethiopians that when asked them about the Egyptians, that they said the Egyptians were a colony drawn out of us by Osiris. So the unique relationship is there, and as I showed in my first video, the ancient Canaanites, Moabites, and Moors, it appears that a war broke out between these factions around 3500 BC. This brings us then to the next source. Yes, this is a lengthy video because in making a case where etymology cannot satisfy the ends of our research, we must then make every correlation possible and present the preponderance of evidence to make the connection. I bring you now to the book The Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. You see, Donnelly considered Plato's accounts of Atlantis as largely factual and attempted to establish that all known ancient civilizations were descended from this supposed lost land. On page 465 we will start. Here we see that the great god Indra, chief god of the Hindus, was formerly king of Meru, and that Deva Nahusha had also been king of Meru. And we must remember that Theopompus tells us that the island of Atlantis was inhabited by the Meropes, and Lenormand has reached the conclusion that the first people of the ancient world were the men of Meroe. We can well believe when we see traces of the same civilization extending from Peru and Lake Superior to Armenia and the frontiers of China that this Atlantean kingdom was indeed universal and extended through all the known countries of the world. On page 171, he says, Lenormand insists that the human race is issued from Upameru, and adds that some Greek traditions point to this locality, particularly the expression, it's in Greek, I can't read it, which can only mean the men sprung from Meru. Manual, page 21. Theopompus tells us that the people whom inhabited Atlantis were the Meropes, the people of Meru. Whence comes the word Atlantic? The dictionaries tell us that the ocean is named after the mountains of Atlas, but whence did the Atlas Mountains get their name? The words Atlas and Atlantic have no satisfactory etymology in any language known to Europe. They are not Greek and cannot be referred to in any known language of the Old World. But in the Nahuatl language, we find immediately the radical A in Atl, which signifies water, war, and the top of the head. From this comes a series of words such as Atlan, on the border of or amid the water, from which we have the adjective Atlantic. We have also Alteca, to combat or be in agony. It means likewise to hurl or dart from the water, and then the preterite makes Atlas. A city named Atlan existed when the continent was discovered by Columbus at the entrance of the Gulf of Uraba in Darien. With a good harbor, it is now reduced to an unimportant pueblo named Akla. Upon that part of the African continent nearest to the site of Atlantis, we find a chain of mountains known from the most ancient times as the Atlas Mountains. Whence this name Atlas, if it not be from the name of the great king of Atlantis? And if this not be its origin, how comes it that we find it in the most northwestern corner of Africa? And how does it happen that in the time of Herodotus, there dwelt near this mountain chain a people called the Atlantes, probably a remnant of a colony from Ceylon's island? How comes it that the peoples of the Barbary states were known to the Greeks, Romans, and Carthaginians as the Atlantes, this name being especially applied to the inhabitants of Fezzan and Bilma? Where did they get the name from? There is no etymology for it east of the Atlantic. A quick point to note is that Dana Marnici, who wrote the Ethnohistory and the Golden Age of the Moors by Ivan van Sertima, also brings up the fact that there was a Moorish tribe called Atlanteans, and from this, some have concluded that the Guataulian tribes were indeed the Atlanteans. Ignatius Donnelly continues, look at it. An Atlas, mountain on the shore of Africa. An Atlan, town on the shore of America. The Atlantes, living along the north and west coast of Africa. An Aztec people from Aztlan in Central America. An ocean rolling between the two worlds called the Atlantic. A mythological deity called Atlas holding the world on his shoulders, and an immemorial tradition of an island of Atlantis. Can all these things be the result of accident? Prophet Noble Drew Ali is the only one to bring to us a true accounting of our history. And he says in our Circle 7 Quran, the 47 verses 6 through 7, that the Moabites from the land of Moab, who received permission from the pharaohs of Egypt to settle and inhabit northwest Africa, they were the founders and are the true possessors of the present Moroccan Empire, with their Canaanite, Hittite, and Amorite brethren who sojourned from the land of Canaan seeking new homes. Their dominion and inhabitation extended from northeast and southwest Africa across Great Atlantis, even unto the present North, South, and Central America, and also Mexico and the Atlantis Islands, before the great earthquake which caused the Great Atlantic Ocean. To bring further verity of the Prophet Drew Ali's claims about these Berbers of North Africa, namely Moabites, being the descendants from the ancient land of Canaan, I sought to consult a living scholar in this instance, and so I reached out to that indefatigable scholar on early Moorish and Berber and Arabian history, Sister Dana Marnici, once known by Dana Reynolds. I gave her the same exact excerpts as cited in the Moorish Quran and quizzed her about any verity to the claim that the Berbers of North Africa were indeed from the ancient land of Canaan. This was her response. Hi, Moorish. Well, first I'll have to agree in general with your view of the Canaanite links to the original Berber people of North Africa. I didn't base this conclusion so much on biblical stories as on ethno-historical evidence and traditional genealogy of Afro-Asiatics, Afro-Arabians, and Africans, as well as archaeological and physical anthropological correspondences. I am not sure who Noble Drew Ali is, but he seems to have known through some other esoteric oral means much of what I had come also to realize. Many ancient and medieval writers like Procopius also claim the Canaanite peoples took over the North African area and settled in places like the Balearic Islands as well. Of course, there is also evidence certain Moorish individuals made it to America. The reason we know Moors or Berbers, and probably Arabs as well, made it to America aside from certain documents is because out of the few African Americans that have been studied, many are coming up with Tuareg DNA and even Yemenite DNA. This, of course, doesn't mean all African Americans are descendants of Berbers. So here we have top ethno-historian, or the top ethno-historian, I should say, in the field, stating that she does in part, based on her finds, agree with what Prophet Noble Drew Ali brought to us way back in the 1900s as a part of our doctrine extending back to our most ancient history. You see, the Moorish religious doctrine is based upon our actual historical history. To elaborate further on the fact, she said the reason we know Moors or Berbers, and probably Arabs as well, made it to the American side, I bring you back to Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly on page 179, where he says, how comes it that very high authority Professor Retzius, Smithsonian Report 1859, page 266, declares with regard to the primitive dolichocephalae of America, I entertain a hypothesis still more bold, namely that they are nearly related to the Guanches in the Canary Islands and to the Atlantic populations of Africa, the Moors, Tuaregs, Copts, etc., which Latham comprises under the name of Egyptian Atlantidae. We find one in the same form of skull in the Canary Islands, in the front of the African coast, and in the Carib Islands on the opposite coast, which faces Africa. The color of the skin on both sides of the Atlantic is represented in these populations as being of a reddish brown. This same book reports on the findings of the so-called Negroes on the walls in the Americas and the Negro idols they found there. In one breath, they speak of them in a high position on the walls, and then they say that they must have been brought here as slaves thousands of years ago, as was the case with most European writers of that day. Nevertheless, these Moabites or ancient Canaanites, Moors, held their dominion here also, just as Prophet Noble Drew Ali had noted. I want to now take you to the name Berber. Remember, in 1839, the people called Negroes on this land, according to the South Carolina laws, or South Carolina Negro laws, where the name Negro, black, essentially, was strictly for the ancient Berbers and their descendants. Firstly, just who were the Berbers then? I have already shown that the Europeans knew exactly who the Berbers were by their own records, which stated that the only people that shall be labeled or branded Negro will be the ancient Berbers and their ancestors, as I have just previously mentioned. I am stressing that point for a reason. In the etymological trace of the word Moor, one of the meanings is Berber, linking those two. You essentially prove that the people who call themselves blacks today, which is nothing more than the Spanish word Negro, are indeed descendants of the ancient Berbers, who were, according to not just the etymologists, but also the historians, were in fact Moors. And it brings you to the etymology of the name Berber, as we see here from the same site, and it tells you from the Arabic name for the people living west of Egypt, perhaps ultimately Greek barbaros or barbarians, see Barbary, and right underneath that you see Hamitic and Cabal, of whom I mentioned in the ancient Moabite video. Remember, when you see the word perhaps in the etymon, it is merely a guess, which means it is inconclusive where the name derives. Then it says see Barbary. So now we go to the etymon of Barbary and we read foreign lands, especially non-Christian lands, from Latin barbaria, see barbarian, meaning Saracens living in coastal North Africa, is attested from 1590s via the French or Old French Barbary, from Arabic barbar, Berber, ancient Arabic name for the inhabitants of North Africa beyond Egypt, perhaps a native name, we see that again, perhaps an Arabic word from Barbara, to babble confusedly, but this might be ultimately from Greek barbaria. The actual relations, if any, of the Arabic and Greek words cannot be settled, but in European languages, barbaria, Barbary, and Barbary have from the first been treated as identical with Latin Barbaria, Byzantine Greek Barbaria, land of barbarians. Saracens, remember, in my last video, were unequivocally linked with the Moabites and the Hagarenes, and they are indeed the Moors of North Africa. Christian writers also called the Moors Saracens, and some sources would use Hagarenes for the Arabians and Moabites for the Moors, and collectively call them Saracens. If you remember the sources I cited above from Book 2 of Herodotus' Histories, the Egyptians called these same exact people barbarians. And if you would but research, you would find many sources that conclude these finds. So being that the etymologists were not conclusive on the word, I sought to those who did field research on the Berbers. This brought me to a book called Research into the Physical History of Mankind, Physical Ethnography of the African Races by James Coles Pritchard, who is an English physician and ethnologist and upheld some of the racist views of the German Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. But nevertheless, on page 172, we read, Section 1 of the Barabra or Berebrine. The people who inhabit the valley of the Nile above Egypt, and from that country to Sennaar, give themselves the appellation of Berberi. By the Arabs, they are termed Nuba. The same people in Egypt, where they are well known, are called Berberines. Their general character and habits are well described by M. Costes as a member of the Egyptian Commission who was at Philae in 1799. Though he would go on to say that they bear no resemblance to the people of West Africa, specialists like Dana Marnici have proven that these are the same exact people. Please consult her works on this subject. An Antediluvian World by Donnelly, the source cited, saw them as one and the same. Drusilla Dungy Houston points out to the Barbary or the Barabra by name, citing several sources. She says this in Book 1 of Wonderful Ethiopians on page 34, where we read, Strabo mentions the Nubians as a great race west of the Nile. They came originally from Kordofan, whence they immigrated 2,000 years ago. They have rejected the name Nubis, as it has become synonymous with slave. They call themselves Barabra, their ancient race name. Sanskrit historians call the old race of the Upper Nile Barabra. These Nubians have become slightly modified but are still plainly Negroid. They look like the Wawa on the Egyptian monuments. The Retu type number 1 was the ancient Egyptian. The Retu type number 2 was in feature an intermingling of the Ethiopian and Egyptian types. So here we see that these Moors rejected the name Nubis or Nubian as it became synonymous with slave. So when you hear people running around saying that they are Nubians, They have no idea of the implication. Some have said that they would rather call themselves Nubians than Moors. Go figure. On page 39 of Drusilla Dungee's book, we read, Pritchard recognizes two branches of the Nubians of the Nile and those of the Red Sea. In the age of Herodotus, the countries known as Nubia and Sennaar were occupied by two different races, one of which he includes under the name Ethiopian. The other was a pastoral race of Semitic descent which led a migratory life. This distinction continues to the present day. The Red Sea nomadic tribes are extremely savage and inhospitable. The Nile Nubis or Barabra are the original Ethiopians. They are agricultural and have the old Hamitic traits. They plant date trees and set up wheels for irrigation. These are the Ethiopians mentioned in the Chronicles as possessing war chariots. Their allies were the Libyans. Semites at that age of the world had no profession of iron vehicles. Herin says that the ancestors of these Ethiopians had lived long in cities and had erected magnificent temples and edifices, and they possessed law and government at that frame of their progress and knowledge, and the social arts had spread in the earliest ages to a considerable part of the world. There are many more passages where these Moors are mentioned as Barabra, so it challenged me to dig deeper to see if there was any linguistic connection between Berber and Barabra. Even though the sources from the ethnologists had concluded such, I was not content with that. When presenting information to an ever-flipping crowd of people who loved their slave status just fine, I knew I had to go the extra mile, which brought me to the Chisholm Hugh edition, 1911, Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, Cambridge University Press, where it gives this description of Barabra. Barabra is an old ethnographical term for the Nubian peoples of Sudan and southern Egypt. The word is variously derived from Berberi, i.e. Berber people, or described as identical with Barabra, figuring in the inscription on a gateway of Thutmose I as the name of one of the 113 tribes conquered by him. And a later inscription of Ramesses II at Karnak, 1300 BC, Barabarata is given as the name of a southern conquered people. Thus it is suggested that Barabra is a real ethnical name confused later with Greek and Roman Barabarus and revived in its proper meaning subsequent to the Muslim conquest. A tribe living on the banks of the Nile between Wadi Haifa and Aswan are called Barabra. So we can at this point reasonably conclude that Berbers are simply a branch of Moors according to the etymological breakdown, and the proof has been brought forth in this video presentation. In doing research into the origin of the word Moor and the people known through time immemorial as Moors, I came to this source in the Har Moad, a book I cited earlier, where it states on page 179 that Isaiah 14:13 sets the king of Babylon on the mountain of the gods, or world, which the Jew who had identified Akkad or Urdhu, the highlands, with Ararat, Urardhu, of the same signification, places in the north. Both Akkad and Armenia are called in the inscriptions Berber, or summits. Now, I do not present this as a definitive. I am simply making correlations with the name with other sources connected with the Moors as Berbers in the etymology that is connected with the Moors. Notice that it says that Urdu or Akkad is also called Berber, which means a summit. A summit is the top of a mountain or hill. This same mountain, which has been the overall theme of this video presentation. Do also remember that Maruk, was also connected with the ancient land of the Moabites, and its twin state, Akkad. Urdu is a Moorish language spoken by the original Kushites, to which this book too details, but tries vainly to attribute to a Turanian peoples, that is, a pale-skinned people from early times. So there you have it. The origin of the name Moor has been laid out for you. Who would doubt it? Who could refute it? Which among you who are detractors, whom I call the true haters of yourselves, those of you who love the brands that the Europeans have labeled you with, which of you can mount a claim against the information thus cited? If you were to turn to the Academia of the Europeans, they have never concluded where the name Moor came from, or any ancient name that links directly to the Moors, at least none that they would admit. So how would you refute the information? If you can, I will shut down my whole operation of seeking to teach my people and wake them up and join you in the deadness of that which you espouse. This is a challenge to the whole field that calls themselves and promotes this European slave label of black as well. Step up to protect your claims. I have stepped up here this day to show improved minds. Do the knowledge to the names that have absolutely no etymological trace, and yet each and every one of them links to each other. Moor, Berber, Moabite, Atlas, Atlantean, Al-Andalus, which is the name given to Spain by the Moors and said by some sources to actually mean Atlantis, Motorbite, and Kush. The closest thing we even find to what Moor or Kush etymologically means is via the Berber word Merin Kush, which literally means the land of God. So is it that Mur means land and Kush means God? The etymologists have never even settled on this word either, and Mortar in a Kush is also known as Marrakesh, which became the capital city of fame in North Africa established by the Moors. Look at Marib in Arabia. It is said that the city of Marib is so old, its existence as a burgeoning city is so remote that it was in ruins at the times of Solomon's reign. Marib and Mar'ab, the original name for Morocco, are so close in name that it is impossible for us to think of it as two separate names by two separate tribes. Maybe a language difference, but the people are certainly the same. I am the message that I bring to you today. Prophet Noble Drew Ali forewarned that new Moors would come in eyes wide open, seeing and knowing, and we are here now. I set out on a mission to personally prove the historicity of what Prophet Noble Drew Ali relayed to us, and I would like to think, based on the responses, that I have done just that. So in that, I have concluded, based on my finds, that the word Moor simply means original man. Peace, God. This is Sheik Way L signing out with love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice.